want to present to you the argument that has been made both by the National Association of Realtors and the landlord lobby and those who have made these arguments in front of the Supreme Court as well, that essentially the original eviction exceeded the authority the CDC had, but what I've heard from them recently is, look, the pandemic is not where it was in September. Yes, the Delta variant's out there, but this can't be a policy that's extended forever. So now's the time to bring it to a close. What do you say to that?
No way. No way. Because we're talking about 7 million people, possibly up to 11 million people. It would be bad enough if it was 20, if it was 100 people. That would be really, really bad. It would be bad if it was 1,000. But millions of people will be out on the street, forced out of their homes. Hundreds of thousands probably have already been forced out of their homes. People have sent me pictures of what dockets look like that with the names on them of evictions. No, that is not good enough. We are talking about the highest government of the United States of America. This is unacceptable. We have to do better by people. And the other thing is this. People look to us because there is nobody else that can fix this. People look to us to make sure that that this is done. I will not sit by and be quiet because we want to talk about procedure and protocol and let's just do the job to make sure people are taken care of. We can go deal with court cases. We can deal with the states. Aside from that, let's just get that penned right now. Get the moratorium done.
Counterpoint, it can be extended forever. I am Ben Burgess. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined, as always, by the full crew for this first segment. That, of course, is Cale Brooks, J. Andrew World, and the inestimable Kelly Carey. What I want to talk about is, before we start up, in just a few minutes, we are going to be watching an interview that I recorded earlier today with a philosopher named Lillian Cicichera about a really good essay that she wrote about how to think about class. But want to start off with what we just watched. So this is really an impressive victory that just happened due to the efforts of Democratic Socialist Congresswoman Cori Bush, who started this protest camping out on the steps of the Capitol, and I think that it's important to acknowledge that as a win, as a meaningful win. I think it's a huge mistake to not count victories as victories because they're incomplete and messy. Because right now, I've got some bad news, guys. Any victory that we get right now is going to be incomplete and messy. Because the organized left and the workers' movement just doesn't have very much power right now. It's incredible that we've accomplished anything. I
would prefer to just be right in my head. I don't want a messy victory, to be honest.
Okay. So obviously, the policy that I am disabusing Cale of the thrill of being correct in an uncomplicated way in his head, and feel a little bad about that. But I think that insofar as we are interested in changing the real world, it is important to acknowledge the real victories when they happen. That said, it is messy and incomplete. Because the left is hilariously and tragically far from holding state power in the United States right now. So we can pressure people who have power, sometimes successfully, into doing good things, but those things aren't going to be the things that we would necessarily want. And so in this case, 11 million people, possibly more by some estimates, are not going to be evicted this week. That's fantastic. But the bad news is that on October 3rd, when the new moratorium expires, and it is more limited in scope, so some people, are facing eviction now, but most of those millions of people are not facing eviction this week. But on October 3rd, when the moratorium expires, anybody who's in that situation now, maybe some people with the 2-month reprieve, will be able to get together their finances and pay back their back rent, and they'll be okay. But everybody else is just 2 months deeper into back rent debt. And so I wrote an article for Jacobin that came out a few days ago called "We Need a World Without Landlords." That was an attempt to think through what we would do if we actually did hold all the levers of state power, which, again, hilariously and tragically far from the case. But I think it's important that we have an answer to that question, because if we don't, then I think we end up in some pretty weird places. So think about what we just said about the eviction moratorium and how this is very good news, but it also just means that on October 3rd, people will be deeper into debt. Think about the battles that have been happening in California in the last couple of weeks over homeless encampments, which obviously police crackdowns on these encampments are a terrible thing. It's a disgusting policy criminalizing homelessness. But also keeping the status quo, having people sleep in the park in the conditions that they're in right now, which really are just awful centers of drug abuse, of violence, of various kinds of crime and predation. None of that is the fault of the people sleeping in the park, who are victims of late capitalist social breakdown. But just keeping that in place, yeah, you can keep on sleeping in the park in these awful conditions, is a pretty miserable outcome too. It's not as bad as what's happening, the police crackdowns, but it is a close second. And we need to think about what we would actually want, because we need to have a horizon for our activism about this stuff that's not just, okay, given the miserable trade-offs presented to us by the current system, which is the least bad option. We do need to figure that out, of course. But we also need to figure out what we would actually want if we were in any position to carry out our program. And what we suggest in the articles that start with not just a moratorium, but actual forgiveness for all of this back rent that was owed during the pandemic. And I know the counterpoint is that's going to put a lot of landlords out of business. And guys, I think that they'd benefit from the dignity of work if they got jobs. And the state could buy up that housing on the cheap, and any contribution people are asked to make after that could be indexed to income. So if you're unemployed right now, you shouldn't have to be paying anything in rent. And going forward from that, and you can have. Yes, a taxation-based system to pick up the rest. And going forward, I think we need to think bigger. I think we can look at what exists in Austria right now, in Vienna, as a whole, one of the greatest accomplishments of the Red Vienna period of the Social Democratic Party running that city. There is what they call social housing, either owned by the city or owned by nonprofit associations, that 62% of the population lives in. These are not concrete block, Moscow in the 1970s kinds of apartments with 3 families lived in the same kitchen. These are nice, attractive, modern apartments. They're not economically segregated. Middle-class people live there too. And if that's not enough, if we do need some private housing, I think tenant cooperatives, that can get started with money from public banks can pick up a lot of the slack, because just having this class of landlords, this is the core argument of the article. This is the point I want to make before I throw it to everybody else. Having this class of landlords that are literally rent-seeking middlemen that you have between, the people building the building and the tenants, between people doing maintenance work. Sometimes that's the same as the landlord, often it's not, and the tenants. Bad news. It's bad news from the perspective of how to organize a society. It's also bad news politically, because having this class of landlords is why we have a situation where 11 million people were almost put out on the street last week, because this is a class of people that exercises a political influence vastly disproportionate to their numbers in the population. So I think we need to celebrate the wins that we accomplished. I don't think we should poo-poo that, but also I think in terms of a long-term vision, we need to be thinking about something fundamentally better, and different.
If I could just go first, because not all of what I have to say is specific, is necessarily specific just to this. So obviously we talk about all the time how far our representatives are separated from the issues that their constituents face. And Cori Bush, this issue specifically, her having been evicted 3 times in her life, and her running on, her running on the platform of being a person who, as a nurse, as a regular person who has faced difficult economic circumstances, and having to fight for a regular living situation for her children as a single mom. This is who she is. So she was on fire for this issue, and we all say this, and we think it can make a difference, and I don't think that it ever strikes anyone really enough how much of a difference it would make if our representatives really were on fire for this much, on fire for every issue that it would impact people, not just their constituents, but everybody. Hit the button for your socialist freeloaders. Yeah, okay.
Oh, so they're just being cute. That's just a way of saying like and subscribe. But yes, please continue, Kelly.
Okay. I thought it was a troll, which we're happy to have trolls watch because it just adds to the numbers. Yeah, I mean, it does make a difference if everybody that represented all of us wasn't just kind of like dead inside about and I don't blame some of them, because I know that a lot of people go to Congress on fire for some of these things, and then after, I don't know what, 10 years, they're just they're dead inside by all of the things that everything goes through, and progress not being made, and just so much stuff happening, and not being able to see any wins, and just every time there's this kind of president, then the Congress rolls over into this type of Congress, and then every time there's this type of president, then it rolls over into this type of Congress, and it's so predictable, and it's whatever. But it's just that if everyone was like this, we would see real change. And to me, the only thing that would make sense would be if we actually put term limits, real term limits, and had younger people constantly entering, and not to block out old people, and older people and middle-aged people from entering, but I mean, Dianne Feinstein, for instance, what the fuck? That is not something that should be happening, and is crazy to me.
Yeah, Feinstein's going to show up to the Senate in 10 years just looking like the evil emperor in Star Wars. It's going to be great.
Yeah, because she's not just dead on the inside; she's dead on the outside too.
That's something that just shouldn't be happening, right? We can all agree on that. But there might be some, for instance, our presidents are getting older, and everyone's oh, they're not all there. That might not be true of some 76-year-old that wants to be president. For instance, somebody that we all would have voted for, to be president. They're all there, and it's fine. But younger people getting into Congress is proving very difficult for progressives. So anyway, that's my point there. Another point is that for this issue specifically, rich people, and I'm not going to like give away like who this person is, but a rich person who is a progressive activist that I know, like very recently I had to explain, and like I'm not kidding, like this person didn't understand. Truly, I had to explain why it really actually very much mattered that someone we knew needed to get paid and was really, really worried that they weren't going to get paid on a Friday, as opposed to like they were worried that they weren't going to get paid until like the following Monday. And they were like sending emails and like trying to like get it done. And I was like, if like he can't get it done, I'm gonna Venmo him, you know, because he had to pay his rent. And this person was like, well, I don't, you know, just pay the rent on Monday. And I was like, he will get evicted. Like the person that he rents from wants to evict him and it's due. And so like they will take that opportunity to give him 0 extra days and he will get evicted. Like he will be out on the street, like, you know, he won't the next day literally have to like pack up his shit and leave, but like maybe, I don't know, but like the person wants him out. If he doesn't pay on Friday, then he'll have to leave. So like he needs to have a check in hand to his and it took me explaining it like a bunch of times, because this person has never had to worry about money ever. They've definitely never paid rent, never paid bills, never had to worry about any of that stuff. And like, that's the situation this person was born into, and that's fine. I mean, you know.
Yeah, why don't the poor just have more money? I mean,
no,
what's wrong with them?
It's not that situation, because like this person is an activist for changing.
But they just literally don't know what it's like.
Yeah.
They just literally have no idea why 2 days would make a difference. They want these systems to change, right? They understand that like these systems are oppressing people. They understand like Marxist theory. They understand all of this stuff, but like why 2 days would make a difference, and like why a landlord would like why someone would lose their home that they have. It's like not everybody owns the home, and like this person knows that, but they don't get it. You know what I mean? They don't get that like you don't have anything else.
Yeah, but they haven't read Capital Volume 3, so do they really understand
that's
that?
probably the main problem.
No, I'm joking. But
yeah,
I think
I was going to say the person who was the chat earlier was from was deep in history. That's Arjun, who is a friend of Michael's. He's been on the David Feldman show. Says
David Feldman. So funny.
Kelly, 100%. And society, true sign of a society in steep decline is being a gerontocracy. Consider nearly every historical example. And yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, I think it probably does like these weird sort of like creatures like Dianne Feinstein, who are like mostly dust at this point, like still clinging to power, is probably like a symptom of bad things. I will say that, you know, youth and not having been around for very long isn't a guarantee of anything. See Pete Buttigieg, and if somebody's actually tied to some kind of useful movement, you know, then they could be good forever. You know, see, you know, Bernie or Corbyn. But
Ben, I think your example that
Cale, please.
Yeah, the example that you use in the article of Red Vienna is instructive for multiple reasons. One, for the reason that's explicit in the article, which is that no, actually we can have publicly funded affordable housing for the public, and we can provide it as a social right to people. And it can actually be good housing. Like, it doesn't have to be slums. It doesn't have to be like decrepit. It's part of the problem is that in the U.S., like when people think of public housing, they think they don't use the word public housing. They call it the projects, and the projects is a really bad place that people don't want to end up in. And I have a friend who lives in NYCHA housing. It's New York Public Housing here in New York, and you know, we'll post photos and videos of like just horrible conditions within the apartment that are not being addressed. Like it's
that way for a reason. It's that way for a reason. I mean, the projects were made for racial segregation, and just like so many other things, and they're not totally racially segregated anymore. But I mean, that's the idea.
Well, certainly, at least like in the 21st century, it's like racialized in the sense that people have a racial notion of like what kind of person lives in the projects, and so it's poor people, but it's also Black people. It's like you get the idea of just like the lowest stratum of society ends up in public housing, and it's a horrific, it is in fact like a bad experience for a lot of people. But it's also not the case that is in fact what public housing is, because we have so many more examples around the world.
I mean, I lived near NYCHA. How could you call it? It was a complex. It was a complex, but there was a school in the middle of it, and it was. I mean, I'm sure the housing wasn't nice. I never went inside, but it was definitely racially, what you would expect. But it was there. I never saw a fight. I never saw any. So it was. I would have thought of them as like middle. The school was extremely nice and like rated extremely well. I thought that they were sending their kids to like a great school, and like there weren't like they were like getting like a leg up, like the whole idea of like what it's supposed to be for people. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It was like it seemed like a nice place to live for families, and like had universal pre-K in, the first floors, community center, little like shopping center, like had, mm-hmm. It was nice.
No, and I don't want to generalize to all public housing, certainly, but there definitely is a certain stigma that exists in the US because of a common experience. And it's, again, what I'm saying is like, it's not in fact the case that is what public housing is, because we have both contemporary and historical examples of a different way of doing public housing. I mean, even today, like if, people were able to, and part of the big problem is that people cannot experience this because the vast majority of like Americans are not going to like go and, do a tour of public housing in other countries. But like if you were able to experience it in Hong Kong or in Berlin or in there's like other major cities that have done successful public housing. And again, like Ben's saying, like Austria is still an example. Like you can have good housing. It can be affordable. You can meet people's needs. The reason why we don't have it is because of power, because of the amount of power that corporations have. And it's important to know, or just to recognize that landlords in the US are not, there's very few like mom and pop landlords. The vast majority of property is owned by like major corporations. And so I think the Red Vienna example is useful for that reason, but it's useful for a second reason, which is getting to part of Kelly's point a moment ago, which is the fact that this was a case where you had working class, some working class, some more middle class, but you had socialists who had the right ideological positions and disposition entering into office and pushing for a transformation of society. And they did accomplish things, but it wasn't the sheer fact that they had the correct ideological position that like they got that because they also ended up getting kicked out. They also lost eventually. And so I think it's certainly the case. I think on the one hand, Kelly is absolutely right that like it does go a long way to get working class people elected. And it does matter that like Cori Bush is a working class person. The AOC prior to being elected was a bartender. These things really do matter because it does actually shape people's politics. But it doesn't overcome the structural factors of the state, which is that the way that the state operates within capitalism, the entire system, because the state doesn't start off by owning, the productive assets of society, because capitalists own the means of production, to use the old jargon, the things that generate wealth in society. They end up calling the vast majority of the economic shots, that the state can say, hey, we want you to pay up this amount, or we want to take these assets from you. We want to reuse these assets for a different purpose. We want you to, we're going to incentivize you to build this thing or not do this thing. But it's always a request from the state. And capitalists have the ability to say, no, I'm not doing that. Screw that. Like, I'm just going to withhold investment. And so that's like ultimately what becomes like the force that we're up against when we say, like, why is it that we just can't have nice things in society? Well, it's because of the structural power of capitalism within the capitalist state. Like, it's the fact that capitalists can veto politicians' decisions on these things. And so that's where I think we keep in mind, like, what Bush and the squad and the rest of them did is extreme. It's important. I think this is a positive and good example of like a demonstration, of a political demonstration, and that like got media attention and ended up successfully leading to a better, albeit messy, but better political outcome. But ultimately, like, what is standing between this outcome and universal public housing is the fact that these corporations that control all these assets have immense power. And so just my last point on this is that I think Bush, in the clip when she's speaking to Chris, she says, if you're homeless, like, you don't have any other resources. Like, you don't have any means of fighting back. Like, it comes down to the politicians. And I think that's true for the homeless for the most part. But it's not exclusively that, because the other means by which we can, in fact, fight for better outcomes with regard to housing are tenant organizers. It's this combination of organizing at the level of the building, which is part of the reason why it's so hard to have national policy on this, because you're literally, like, oftentimes the fights are limited to, an apartment building or something. And politicians working in tandem to put pressure on these corporations that own this property from below. And again, you'd have to need to coordinate across several buildings simultaneously, which is something that people have been attempting in COVID. Like, actually pretty remarkable to see how much organizing has happened, at least like from my vantage point in New York. And then it's people like Cori Bush, and it's having these two work in tandem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also just wanted to highlight your point about the projects, because the crucial difference, I mean, Kelly is totally right about the racial history of the way that these housing projects were built, but also the fact that they are and always have been economically segregated, right? There's exclusively, for people, at the bottom end of their financial resources, and like all means tested programs, that means that it's going to be something that most people don't think that they're ever going to need. Sometimes they're wrong, but they don't think that they're going to need it. So there's not a lot of political pressure to have it be, well funded and good, and I mean, quality varies, but I mean, like, that's a huge problem. And also, like, the people who are likely to be eligible are least likely to vote, and that in itself makes a difference. I mean, having this be like in Vienna, where you have 62% of the population lives in social housing, including tons of middle class people, some of whom will wait like a year or two on a waiting list, for an opening because the rent is so cheap. Then it's something that there's this like huge cross section of the population perceives as being in their interests. And if like a conservative party comes to power next year and starts to talk about cutting funding for this or raising rent, there'd be a huge backlash. And it wouldn't just be that like a fairly politically powerless minority of the population would be upset. Andy, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was mostly just kind of thinking about the part of the reason why the projects are tend to be run down is in part our Protestant work ethic and trying to be like, well, if you want to have a better place, you have to earn it, kind of thing. And that's not necessarily true, because I mean, I live in a dump right now, and we got. I'm sorry, I have absolutely terrible neighbors. I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't think I can't even organize them to close the front door, let alone anything else. So these are actually other problems that we have to deal with too. When we organize, when we think about this stuff, is like who's actually willing to join in. So I am quite glad that we have people like Cori Bush out there fighting for us. And we do need to have more than just like we need to be multi-layered. We need to have because like part of this is also there's not a place in the state that can actually take and divvy up some of these programs for like rent relief. And that's one thing that's not really talked about very much. That there isn't these. I'm sorry, I'm a little all over the place here, but anyways, yeah, just a bunch of random thoughts here. But there isn't these people there to distribute the funds, and sometimes that ends up going with like Biden saying, "Hey, yeah, why don't you just spend it on the cops?"
Yeah, fair.
What is the plan for say that, I don't know, 1/8 of these people have like some familial place to go, right? What's the plan for the other people? What is, like, if all the other people that get evicted or actually go homeless, what's the plan?
No, exactly. I mean, exactly. I mean, Silver Harlow pointed out in the chat earlier, that you could, like, the time when 500,000 people on the streets was referred to as a homeless crisis. This would be a ridiculous explosion of that. But before
this is my other rich people thing. They think that, like, and this is the person that said the thing about Mitt Romney. They think that all of the people have a plan B. That, like, everyone has a plan B. There's like that everybody. It's like Tucker Carlson insists that guy insists on saying that every single homeless person is a drug addict and a mentally ill degenerate. Okay, so they're all addicted to drugs, and which, I mean, to me is, you need help, and they're also mentally ill and degenerates. They're mentally ill and addicted to drugs, so they need a lot of help. In my opinion, in his opinion, and there was one segment where he thought they should all be killed. So so that's his solution. So all the homeless people should be killed, and I mean, is that the plan? Is if we get more homeless people, we just kill them all?
I mean, I think certainly a lot of. I mean, I think the honest plan from people who support these crackdowns does involve a lot more criminalization and ultimately, I think maybe not killed, but I think a lot of people would be going to prison. Certainly given a greater level of social breakdown like Brazil, where has right-wing militias that actually do murder people, then it might be a different scenario. But I mean, I think it is important to acknowledge
he's currently broadcasting from Hungary.
Right? We could do a whole thing about Tucker Carlson another time, which I'd actually like to do. But I think it is important, as grotesque as a lot of the things he supports are, to acknowledge the germ of truth. Lots of people on the streets do have drug problems. Lots of people on the streets are suffering from mental illness, but the solution is that they should be given stable, dignified term health, and this should be paired with mental health services and addiction counseling and things that would actually help people to get their lives together, instead of just using this to condemn them and as an excuse not to do anything. Before we move on, and do the preview for Thursday, before we leave this topic, do we have the other clip, Cale?
Everyone keeps asking, what should we do now? We're going to keep here. We're going to stay here until the rest of the work gets done.
We're not buying the theatrics. We're not buying the theatrics.
Not we, you're just one person.
No, I'm not one person. My man right there. We have 137 people watching.
137
yes.
people. Damn.
They were just working really hard. I think what they're doing is admirable, and I think that
what do you mean? What was I doing? Informing people. You think I shouldn't inform people?
Yelling isn't important.
How am I trolling?
Because you're asking irrelevant questions.
How is it irrelevant that they're using money? How is it irrelevant that they're using money for wars when they could be giving money to the homeless? They voted for. They voted to increase the budget for Israel.
No, they voted against it.
How
you
much?
don't even know what you're talking about.
I know what I'm talking about.
Research before you go out.
They increased the budget for Israel in apartheid state.
At home.
They increased the budget for an apartheid state.
No idea what you're talking about.
I know more than you. I know more.
Okay, that goes on, but we don't have to keep
Yeah, that's more than enough of that. I just wanted to play this because we were talking earlier about as complicated and messy as they often are, as much as we do need to have a better long-term vision of like what a socialist housing policy looks like, what we would do if we could actually get the program that we want and not have to navigate, between the horrible the horrible alternatives that are promoted by the current system. It is also really important that you see in a moment like this, what Cori Bush is doing because of that experience in her life that Kelly's talking about, because she has the right political takeaway from that experience, like Cale's talking about. That's what Cori Bush is doing there was really, really good. I mean, this is like the best thing that any congressperson has done with the platform that they get, the sort of national spotlight that they get for being in Congress for a very long time. And this is the kind of attitude that you get from some people on the left, which, this is an extreme example. Some YouTuber, I don't know who that guy is. I don't care who he is. That's not the point of this. But some YouTuber standing there on the Capitol steps while this really important protest is going on, yelling out, "We don't buy the theatrics," as some sort of like stunt for to get YouTube content out of it. And man, like there are things that you can do in left media that can actually be useful for, what we do here is not the same as politics, as political organizing. That you have to actually log off and start knocking on doors and stuff. But at its best, this can be political education, inspiration, theoretical clarification, entertainment's fine also, but it should not ever be at the expense of, it should not ever be actually like literally heckling useful things that people are doing in the real world. So that's it. It's just a very small point, but it's like, just don't be a fucking wrecker.
Yeah, I mean, like, on the one hand, there of course is, like, I think a generally correct critique of kind of performative politics, where people will do some stunt or like they'll invent a media creation, they'll get a celebrity to do something, and they say this is politics because we've like gotten a lot of people to look at this thing or talk about this thing. And the reason why we dislike, I mean, sometimes it's obnoxious, but like the reason why like that doesn't become our go-to on the left is because typically it doesn't really produce results. I think what Cori Bush and the squad did is a good example of like how to do performative politics, to use the language, effectively. Like that you like, it shows both like the possibilities of, of being able to like change the conversation around this issue, and like get people to focus on this and to put pressure on the Biden administration. Obviously, it also shows the limitations, like that, we've said, like the moratorium was extended only until October, but like that obviously matters a great deal. So like the takeaway isn't like this was a useless bad demonstration. No, like this obviously produced results, and that we should learn something from that, and then also take away like, okay, but what are the limitations? I think to Ben's point, like the reason why this clip is so obnoxious, like it's not like it'd be one thing if someone made the critique I literally just made on YouTube, like I just did. So it'd be one thing if you did what I did. It'd be another thing if you're doing what he's doing, which is like harassing people who are trying to pull off a demonstration, because he's not trying to like help advance that project. He has no, or at least like, I don't know what's in his head. I don't care what's in his head. Like objectively, like what he's doing is counterproductive to actual organizing work. And you could argue about like the strategic efficacy of that work, but like you as like someone who's like a comrade in that fight should be like, say, okay, I want to support you, and then we can figure out afterwards like if this worked or not. Turns out this worked, so like there's something to be learned from that.
I think I saw Ryan Grimm like right next to him and in the beginning, and I don't support anyone screaming like that close to Ryan Grimm, because he has work to do. People, get it together. It's my hope.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like Ryan, gotta have him back on the.
And then I saw him like all the way over to the other side of the steps, and it's like, hi, maybe he can't hear right now because you just screamed in his ear.
That's literal violence, Kelly.
I know.
Well, I think,
all right. We should. Oh, sorry, Andy. Real quick, then we should move on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say I think Anders Lee was the person in the clip there trying to defend Ryan Grimm's hearing. So go Anders if that was it.
All right, good job, Comrade Anders. Thank you guys, Andy, Kelly. Really appreciate it. So I want to show a preview before we get to the interview with Lillian Cicichera for the conversation that I had for patrons with our good friend and my frequent co-author Matt McManus, which in some ways it's a very sharp turn in subject matter, but in a different way I think it's not. Although the connection might not be initially obvious. So the kind of launching pad, like the sort of starting point of this discussion that I had with Matt was about a video that a very popular, I think probably the most popular left-wing YouTube man, I really hate the phrase content creator. That sounds so like lifeless and neoliberal. I'm a creator of content, but person who produces videos for YouTube, which is of course Natalie Wynn, better known by the name of her channel, Contrapoints. So Natalie just did this really interesting video that dropped on Saturday. Some people who are watching or listening to this may have watched the impromptu stream we did to watch it and then comment on it. And it's called Envy. And it starts off in this place that seems almost like, I think some people were confused when they started watching it because it might seem almost Jordan Peterson-esque, in the kind of psychological exploration of feelings of envy and resentment. But I think it went to a really interesting place. Now, granted, I love the video, but I am wildly biased. Let's watch the first clip.
Shook argues that the fear of envy is a major inhibiting force in many societies.
In Haiti, G. E. Simpson found that a peasant will seek to disguise his true economic position by purchasing several smaller fields, rather than one larger piece of land. For the same reason, he will not wear good clothes. He does this intentionally to protect himself against the envious black magic of his neighbors.
Now this kind of thing is not unheard of in America. Like, I've known people from seriously wealthy families who move to the city and they dress like gutter punks.
All right, so obviously, like I said, I have a bias here. I was in the video a few times. She had me read a few of the quotes that were in the voiceover. I did not hate that. Having been a fan of her videos since I think 2018. But I would have really liked this video even if I had not been in it. So let's watch a second clip, one that gives you a little bit more of an idea of where she's ultimately going in terms of the subject matter.
I've noticed that working class, non-academic socialists do tend to be more productive and more self-advancing, involved in unionizing or organizing. Whereas, it's usually people who went to college.
I went to college!
Presumably because they had middle-class ambitions at some point, but whose middle-class ambitions have failed, who become the great critiquers of capital. I mean, I can tell you from experience that when I was eating Chef Boyardee over my master's degree, that's when I was most likely to say things like, according to Antonio Gramsci, in the logic of late-stage capitalism, the culturally hegemonic neoliberal ideology manufactures the consent of the subaltern. So point taken, but some conservatives take this argument way too far and try to argue that the entire left is nothing but a coalition of resentment.
All right. So that gives you a little bit more of an idea of what the video ultimately ends up being about. It's a literally feature-length video. I mean, really, it's a movie, and I mean, not like a 80-minute movie you might watch on Shudder, but like a Marvel movie or something. It's that length, and in over the course of the video, I mean, obviously it's just very entertaining to watch. I mean, the production value and the way that the humor and the kind of intellectual content of it and everything are mixed together. I mean, this is something that she's always been very good at, and she's definitely at the height of her craft. But the argument that she ends up building about it is about how this kind of concept of envy, which crucially for the argument does not mean the same thing as like covetousness, right? That's sometimes how we use the word envy. Like, oh, I envy what these other people have, so therefore I'm going to try to get it too. That's very importantly not what envy means in this context. In fact, it's in certain respects the opposite of the way that negative emotions towards some people having things that you don't is handled if you're actually feeling envy. So if you're doing something concrete in the real world to change the situation, to get the things that you don't currently have through, for example, material redistribution, that's very much not a politics of envy or of resentment. I'm not going to say the word in the pretentious French way. That in the sense that Natalie is talking about in the video, which she actually contrasts in the video to Marxist class politics. So in this conversation that I had with Matt today, again, it's going to be dropping for patrons on Thursday. We kind of started using this this video as the inspiration, as kind of the launching pad for the larger discussion. We started by doing a deep dive on Nietzsche's ideas and how they relate, to what we think, because in certain respects, Nietzsche is definitely somebody who is politically an enemy of a left project. There's a real, very strong anti-egalitarian impulse in a lot of his writing. And then ultimately where we went with it, though, was how you can take some of those themes from what Nietzsche is talking about resentment, and actually draw lessons from it that are extremely useful to that kind of egalitarian project. Show how, in one of the examples we talked about in the video, like somebody like Scott Walker appealing to resentment of unionized school teachers in Wisconsin who had summers off and job security, fit in with this Nietzschean point, or talking about how thinking about wanting to avoid this kind of trap of the politics of resentment in that Nietzschean sense can actually help us clarify, how to think think about intra-left debates and how socialist politics can go wrong and how it should go right. So we're just going to play a brief clip from this. That's from the part where we are directly talking about Nietzsche.
If you look at the kind of trajectory of Nietzsche interpretations, there's kind of three waves that we can talk about, right? One was an initial wave where he was very badly misinterpreted by Nazis and fascists as being kind of a proto-fascist figure, right? Arguing for the Superman who's going to lord it over other people. And he was interpreted this way, for instance, by Bertrand Russell, right? Where Bertrand Russell famously just denounced him in his History of Western Philosophy and said, Nietzsche's philosophy is pretty much garbage. It can be summarized by that one line in King Lear where he says, I shall do such terrible things as shall be the horror of the earth, or something to that effect. Right. And, people like Walter Kaufmann, who kind of pioneered the second wave of Nietzsche interpretations, really and very rightfully countered that, no, Nietzsche is not a nationalist. He certainly would never have gone in for the kind of biological racism endorsed by the Nazis. He was vehemently anti-Semitic. Right. And he characterized himself as a good European in many instances, said some truly funny things about, the noxiousness of German nationalism and imperialism. So we had to put that to aside. And the way that Kaufmann and others at this period interpreted him was kind of almost as an apolitical, not quite apolitical, but mostly apolitical bohemian intellectual, right? He had these interesting things to say about art. He was a critic of moralism. He had kind of these nasty barbs to strike against Christian conservatives in particular, right? And so in this way, we can kind of recover what was interesting in Nietzsche while dumping all these bad associations, right? And then there was a third wave of Nietzsche's scholarship, if you want to call it that, really pioneered by left-wing post-structuralists in France, people like Michel Foucault, who famously declared in the 1970s that he was a Nietzschean. It's kind of ironic when you think that Jordan Peterson, also likes Nietzsche, but called him like a postmodern neo-Marxist, right? Probably have a lot more to say to each other if Peterson never actually read Foucault. But, this kind of interpretation repoliticized Nietzsche, but in a much more radical and egalitarian way, where they took a lot of the resources that were put forward in his book to raise critiques of imperialist universalism, various systems and structures of power, and their association with various forms of knowledge. And all this was done for really radical purposes, right? To kind of emancipate people from ideology, discourse, calcified ways of thinking, whatever you want to put it.
All right. So I don't know if that clip gave you how much of a sense this gave you of it, but I really like this conversation. I actually think that this is one of the best, this is one of the best discussions we've done for the show in a long time, maybe, certainly top 10. And I think maybe the best, there are many, many places you can watch me talk to Matt on YouTube, on this show, on the show he co-hosts, Plastic Pills, on Jacobin's YouTube channel. And I've had a lot of good conversations with him. I think this one might be my favorite. I thought that the way we managed to sort of go from geeking out philosophically about Nietzsche to having like a really good, really interesting political discussion that put together a lot of different things I'm thinking about in a different way was really good, and I'm excited about it. I'm excited to hear what patrons have to think when they have watched it or listened to it. It's available in both forums because this was fire. This was good. So in any case, just as a reminder, the conversation with Matt drops on Thursday, and for patrons, we'll do a longer public preview then, but the full interview drops on Thursday for patrons. So if you go to patreon.com/Ben Burgess, become a GTAA patron, you get those bonus episodes every Thursday. You get post games every Monday night, typically at 9:30, although it's going to be more like 10 tonight. After the regular public episode, there's a post game for patrons, which often goes all the way up to 11. When I pull the plug for the sake of everybody's sanity, and you get occasional Discord office hours, group voice chats. You get access to that Discord as a discussion forum. We've done a few Discord movie nights. We're going to do more of them. You get early access to the monthly Sopranos recap bonus episodes that we've been doing just as a fun extra thing with Nando Villa, Big Waz, Wazin Lambre, and Mike Racine. And most importantly, if you like the work we're doing here, right? Like all of these things are just ways of saying thank you. But the thing itself, right? Becoming a patron, it's not a subscription service. It's solidarity. So if you like the work we're doing here, you want us to continue that and pay everybody who does work on the show and produce bigger and better things in the future, please do consider being a patron, especially right now, since this is about 8 days after I stopped having a full-time teaching job, since I did not renew my contracts for this fall. I'm going to be teaching one adjunct class, but I did not renew my full-time contract this fall because I want this, right? What I do for this show, what I do for Jacobin, book writing, etc. I want this to be my full-time job. Please do consider becoming a patron if you can. Meanwhile, though, we are at the main event. So this is a conversation that I had, has to be pre-recorded for reasons that I explained at the beginning, with Lillian Cicichera, who is a co-host of another really good podcast called What's Left of Philosophy. All right. I am now joined by Lillian Cicerchia, who is, among several other things, is a co-host of a podcast that I really like from what I've listened to of it, called What's Left of Philosophy. Thank you for joining us, Lillian.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for inviting me. Happy to be here.
So I should say that in case anybody's confused about this is pre-recorded because Lillian is in Berlin. So if we did this at the normal time, she'd be recording at like 5 a.m. or something, which is, I guess she's just not quite dedicated enough for that.
Yeah, sorry, not dedicated enough to the cause, and my philosophy brain fades at that point in time, definitely.
Yeah, very fair. So beyond the association with that podcast, is there anything else you'd like to mention about yourself before we get started?
I'm a postdoc in social philosophy at the Free University of Berlin. So I'm doing critical theory out here, and I'm working on a book project that's related to the paper. If people want to watch out for that in the next year or two, it'll be called The Competitive Constraint, and the subtitle is A Critique of Capitalist Domination. So.
Cool. So yeah, I really liked this paper. This is something that I think I would just on Twitter, somebody like it just, there was some other discussion that was going on, and somebody recommended it. So this is it. It's called Why Does Class Matter? And I liked it. I think because certainly coming from the the academic background that I do, in analytic philosophy, where there are this has started to change in maybe some good ways and some ways that I'm not crazy about also, but certainly like at the time that I was like a grad school or anything like that, like unless you were specifically like obviously there are people who did political philosophy or whatnot, but like outside of that, it was sort of proudly apolitical. I think was the predominant way that it was, and certainly I mean for myself, I was even always kind of on like totally separate tracks. There's like what I did when I did philosophy, and then there was like what I did when I did politics. And the two were really not that much more related than they would be, if I'd had some completely unrelated job for a long time. And there are, of course, there's always been kinds of philosophy departments where that's not at all the case, which is a lot of the tradition that you're engaging with here. But but despite that, you mentioned critical theory earlier. It's just like, I don't know, there's probably no way to put this that's not like obnoxious in its implications, but it's very clearly written. I like that.
Oh, thank you. One time when I was a graduate student, the chair of my department just told me that I basically didn't understand the English language, and he was one of these analytic guys, and he was right. And so I've aspired to make myself clear despite my critical theory training. So I appreciate that.
All right, fair enough. So the point of the paper is to is to do the thing that like the debate that the debate that you're intervening in is something that is the kind of thing that philosophers do. It's analyzing concepts, but obviously in a very politically relevant way, especially because in some of it you're engaging with people who are worried that people who are saying the kinds of things that you're interested in saying are class reductionists, which is probably a phrase that some people have watch or listen to this, have heard thrown around before. But I guess maybe one place to start with it is just to the sort of pre-existing distinctions in the conversation you're intervening in, right? So one of the first things you talk about in the paper is two ways of thinking about class. One of them is stratification theory, and one of them is conflict theory. You want to unpack that a little bit?
Yes. So I'll actually take a little bit more of a step back
Sure.
with the debate that I'm intervening in, because when I start talking about different theories of class conflict, part of what or class, not even class conflict, is part of what I'm doing is making philosophers aware that there actually is a debate about what class is. So what I'm trying to accomplish in the paper is to have a better idea of how class shapes a broader terrain in which various social oppressions and perhaps indeed other forms of domination take place. You can't do that unless you have a workable concept or a social theory of class. And so what I started to notice is that people who would talk about class reductionism, notably feminist philosophers, philosophers of race, they seem to never talk about different ways of understanding class. And so what started to emerge as a graduate student, I realized that people had very robust and competing and different ideas about gender and race and what they are. Nobody had any competing ideas of what class is. And so I started realizing that there's this trifecta called class, race, and gender, and only one of those terms is underspecified or not actually understood as a theoretically robust problem. We seem to all just use the word class like we know what it means. And if you take a step outside of philosophy, you'll find that there actually is a conceptual and social theory debate about what class is, and depending on which social theory you agree with, you're going to have different empirical results if you're a sociologist or a political scientist. So to answer your question, there's a couple different theories of class. The dominant ones are stratification theory and class conflict theory. Class conflict theory is more similar to what people on the left probably know about when it comes to talking about Marxism or the socialist tradition, where you talk about there are workers and there are capitalists, there are employers and employees, and they engage in conflict. And the structural positions of these people tell you something about their interests, what they're going to do, what they have to get what they want, which is the way Eric Olin Wright puts it, which I always find helpful. But stratification theory is actually the dominant way of thinking about class. So if you're on the left and you are a fan of Ben Burgis, you're probably like, aha, I already think about capitalists and workers. That's how we think about class. But the alternative view is actually the one in the social sciences that is dominant. And it's a view of thinking about class as having basically an infinite number of types. So you can determine class by someone's income bracket. So everyone has seen graphs in which, depending on where you put the cutoff, maybe it's $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. People under that are middle class, and people over that are the 10% or the 1%. So you can imagine these bar graphs in which income will kind of create a different class schema for you, depending on what you're interested in showing. You can do it by education. You can do it by lifestyle. You can do it by access to various forms of what are called human capital, like networking and so on. So for the most part, in political science and in sociology, that's how people think about class. They contest kind of the variables to use. And class conflict theories, which are associated with the Marxist tradition and sometimes with Max Weber, are theories that think about class as a categorical thing. You have the point of view I was referencing, which is that, your structural position in the society is going to shape your relationship to other people. That's class conflict theory. And then I started, we can get into other points that I make in the paper.
No, that's good. So I do want to linger on that for a second. That first distinction, because I think that, like, one of the things that was clarifying for me about reading this is that I think that this kind of stratification view, like being both oversimplifying and a little provocative about it, like it's the view that class is a spectrum, not a binary. But that position and the way you describe it, realize that I think a lot of people who maybe like their official position is the conflict theory, like if you ask them, like, hey, Bob, tell me what class is, like what they, and I'm talking about like people on the left, people who even do left media or whatever, they would give you the conflict is, and you describe it in the paper, that these are structural categories, that people have, that there is this, not just what stratification theorists are talking about, which is that there's this, you have different life outcomes, depending on your class position, which is certainly true, and certainly captures something really important about why, like, class society is objectionable in the first place. But if you're a conflict theorist, that's not what you think class is. You think class is that whether you're in the structural position of being a worker or a capitalist, or I don't know, maybe some intermediary layer, and that workers as a class are dominated by capitalists as a class, that there's exploitation, that this gives workers a collective interest in being a collective political agent, to bring about change. That's what they give you if you ask them, right? Well, what is class? But then sometimes I think a lot of people, without quite realizing it, oftentimes when they're talking about maybe specific questions about class, they sort of slip into something that sounds a lot more like stratification theory, because just it's so incredibly common in the social sciences and among like political discourse outside of the left, even, that it's very, like, I think I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking about a discussion that I had recently on another podcast about what like people argue about this category, the PMC, the professional managerial class, and what that means and how it relates to being in the work class. And that suddenly gets, like, that discussion very quickly gets like very, very stratification theory-ish. So if nothing else, it seems like there's something useful about just putting labels on these things, so we at least know, like, what categories we're at least aware of, what categories we're using.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that in terms of the PMC debate, but I think there's definitely something to what you said. I want to kind of go back to the first set of things that you said, which is that depending on how you think about class, it's going to matter to you differently. So if you just think that class is lifestyles or a certain set of cultural attitudes or even morals, right? Maybe that's how some people describe the PMC. The significance of that is going to be very different than if you think that the class structure gives these people a certain kind of leverage over others or vis-a-vis their employer. And the way that this has usually been cashed out, like normatively, like when we say what's wrong with capitalist society, is that people who think in terms of stratification theory think the problem is inequality. And they think that we're talking about relative advantage or disadvantage. So this is like most of the privilege discourse. Yeah, like this is people have unjustified advantages, arbitrary disadvantages, but it has a long history in the way liberals think about inequality. What we want to do is get rid of the morally arbitrary inequalities, but other arbitraries might be justified and acceptable. So that's what we debate, whether or not inequality is justified. When it comes to class, it's like the other view, class conflict theory, you're talking about domination, which means that the problem is that class exists at all. That's a pretty different orientation towards the kind of injustice that we are all discussing. And the second thing that you said is that the reason that like normative framing is important is that there is this really interesting thing that happens that I think you're exactly right, where you talk to so-called radicals, people on the left, and then you seem to kind of all be in agreement that there's class conflict, and then you start to realize that you're not in agreement. And about like the nature of the problem, or the nature of the beast, of the thing that you're talking about, the structural issue with class. And I just want to say that I think this is a really profound thing to try to attack, which is what I try to do with this paper, because this was most of my experience in graduate school. Like, you read people who seem to kind of take for granted, like, the things Marx says about capitalism. You know, they read volume 1 of Capital, various other writings, and they're like, yes, this seems true. You know, basically there's a class of workers and there's a class of capitalists, and they seem antagonistic. And then they repeat this, and then they keep saying things like, but this can't explain. This can't explain. We need to go beyond this. This is too simple. This can't explain. And then you start realizing that there was a generation of people that entered the academy from the New Left that kind of took for granted these like socialist leaning ways of thinking about class, but didn't develop them, evolve them, didn't remain interested in class. And so as the discourse prevailed, what ends up happening is that you're not talking about class. Class is just in the background. You're talking about race, gender, sexuality, other things. And then because you haven't taken a look at the concept you're actually mobilizing, you end up relying on a stratification theory of class anyway, because for some reason that didn't get developed. And realizing that there's a substantive problem with that is actually probably one of the most difficult things about getting into these debates, because people seem to agree that there is a class structure, but they don't mobilize any relevant idea of class that would lead you to think that class is actually playing a role in their analysis of the world. And so then kind of getting behind that awkward, wait, you said you agree with Marx, but you don't agree with Marx. That's like something I'm kind of trying to hope to clear the air on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think that, actually, I think in a weird way, like, you know, when I think back to discussions that I would have with like academic friends that were long, you know, like basically longer than like 6 years ago, because there was this weird thing that happened in 2015 or so, when a very good thing, you know, but that a lot of people who had been sort of like not very political or sort of vaguely liberal or whatever, who moved to the left, maybe say whatever, that like good things, you know, but like what I think about a lot of conversations, in some cases with some of the same people, you know, from before that, they would often have a very easy time seeing, because this is part of mainstream liberal discourse, that there was something about, like, regardless of how they conceptualized it theoretically, or if they had a theoretical conceptualization, there's something about race and gender, you know, in as they play out in American society, that's bad and unjust, and then trying to make any sort of socialist points often involves sort of putting, really, I mean, I even think about like some of the conversational strategies that I would use, and so some of these, like, basically just sort of trying to say, oh well, this is like that, right? You know, that this is the same kind of thing, and then going to the present, since you talk about how some people who are, you know, philosophers of gender, race, critical race theorists, etc., have this worry, you know, the second you start saying that there's something that's analytically different or important, you know, about class, about they raise this kind of specter of class reductionism, which is always, like, in one way is always like a really confusing charge, because, you know, taken like what it often sounds like people are saying, like in this case, it's like stepping aside from the theoretical debate a little bit to just like its practical political application. But oftentimes what it seems like people are saying when they throw around this accusation of class reductionism is that there's some socialists who are just indifferent to the, you know, issues about you know, like racism and sexism and other forms of social prejudice, or of disparities, you know, from resulted from historical injustices about these things, are maybe indifferent to them, maybe see them as like distractions from class struggle, I always think, well, okay, but who, right? Who really says that, right? Like I want some names, because it seems like all the socialists I've ever known not do not exhibit indifference to those things. But when I start thinking about it as assuming this kind of background stratification idea of class, then maybe I can understand a little bit more where the charge is coming from. Because if you say, okay, what are all the things that might shape some individuals unjustly, objectively, arbitrarily having worse life outcomes than some other individual? And there are certainly stories that you can tell that are going to be accurate, that link it to those other features, that say that that if the individual in question is black, then there could be things about the history of Jim Crow and redlining and ongoing prejudice by people, by certain decision makers, etc. All of which that are going to be relevant to seeing how this person ended up in a different position than other people who aren't black. That if we're talking about women who have experienced sexism in certain contexts, etc., right? Then again, all these things can be relevant. And if you're sort of saying, well, all right, well, I could see how those things are relevant, and I could also see how what the education or income level of your parents were, unrelated to those other features, could be relevant. And so that must be what you're talking about when you talk about class. Yes. And now I can kind of understand what somebody means. They say, oh, well, look, you seem to be making this especially big deal about the last one. And that makes it sound like you're not really tracking the other ones. And so you're a class reductionist. And now maybe I understand what they mean.
Yeah, that's a really interesting. I'm happy that some of the arguments I made helped you to think about that they actually might just be thinking about class differently than you were assuming a different framework. I mean, if you're somebody who's a socialist, I think the best way to put the position on, so there's different positions. One is, what are the causes of all these different oppressions? And then there's what to do about them. So let's bracket the causes of all these different oppressions. I think that if you have a class conflict way of thinking about things, then whether or not you can give a total theory of social domination that is just directly related to the class structure or not. What you think is basically that race and gender have a class character, that there are class differences among people who fit into those groups respectively, or together. And you also think that you have to go through the class structure in order to create more social equality. And socialists have usually adopted a position that's the experience of going through the class structure usually changes a lot of people's biases, prejudices, kind of brings to the fore commonalities that weren't there before. Different norms emerge, and if you're organizing your workplace, solidarity in contrast to competition. And socialists have usually said that is an important transformative goal, but it's also a part of the solution to a particular problem, which is that the class structure creates inequality. It creates differential kinds of inequality across it. So people vary by skill level. People get thrown thrown out of work. They have to find new jobs in different kinds of industries. They have to relocate. There's a way in which the class structure creates heterogeneity, and the task for socialists is to organize people who are already very different and to try to get them to see that they have something in common and to start to think about common or even universal goals and interests, aspirations, values. And if you see that that's the problem, that you have to go through that set of obstacles or challenge those constraints as opposed to going around them and addressing things separately, then this problem of class reductionism doesn't really make any sense, because you're talking about a transformative social process that has to happen to relieve inequality, period. But if you have a stratification theory of class, that means that the common thing to say is, well, racism and sexism, they affect people across the class structure. It's not just poor people or working people that experience these things. It's equally bad all the time. And then your your strategy for challenging those things is going to be kind of heterogeneous and piecemeal and addressing one group and one constituency and not another. And then it takes on the character of more like interest group politics than a transformational politics. And so I do think that like what is in the background in a lot of these debates is genuinely different ways of perceiving the problem. And when we talk about class reductionism, I just think that's a slur that's evolved to like slander the left since 2015, like the emergent and nascent but weak social democratic left that has gotten itself more of a platform. I think it's ironic, and people should think critically about how that emerged right when Bernie started to run. And, think about what work that is doing to like create more fog. Because what it really exists are not class reductionists. It's disagreements about how to solve the problem and different perceptions of what the problem is. And if you stop calling people names like reductionist for just 1 second and try to understand, like this is maybe being a little more polemical, try to understand what you think the problem is and what they think the problem is and why your perceptions of that problem differ, then I think we'd make a little more progress here. That's my take on it.
Yeah, no, I mean, completely agree with that. I think that, sort of like a lot of what's being tracked, like we use the word oppression a lot in these discussions, which is, I think, a little bit of a slippery word because it's really hard to. Maybe this is just lack of creativity on my part, and there is like a really like tight and useful way of defining that I don't know, but like it's often hard to sort of see what that means, except that like someone is being treated in some way that is in some way unjust, like that kind of seems like what oppression means in practice, which. And then people attach that to terms, like race and gender in ways that I think oftentimes there's a slippage because not because of course these things aren't extremely relevant to like diagnosing where different life outcomes can come from, and in some cases they definitely are, but because it's often unclear what the target is. I mean, you talked about like different approaches to solving problem, but sometimes those different approaches come from just having a different idea of what problem there is to solve in the first place. So is the problem, for example, that due to America's apartheid history, Black people are disproportionately likely to have to sit at the bottom, economic position as post-white people, but is the problem that anybody's sitting at that position? In which case, politics based on solidarity, between everybody in that position to try to transform society would make sense, or is the problem that the wrong people are sitting in that position? That what a just outcome would look like would be if every class of society and every social strata, within classes even, had exactly the correct proportions of members of every race and gender and sexuality and all that stuff, because depending on which one of those you see as the problem to be solved, you're going to end up with very different solutions.
Yeah, and this is a really complicated thing to point to get across. I mean, if I can just kind of muse a little bit on like why this is so confusing. I mean, so I was just listening to Adolf Reed and Walter Ben Michaels were talking about disparities, and they've been writing about this in the past couple of years. And I'll admit that in the first place, I didn't see their point. I didn't understand the points about disparities because, Adolf Reed always accuses people of, if as long as the ruling class is like 13% Black and what is it, 60% white, and then whatever other demographics are supposed to create this composite representative ruling class and parliament and so on, then that's what that's when oppression stops. And I always just thought he was really oversimplifying things. I just thought, I don't think anyone wants that. Like, that's not what people are after. That's not their professed goals. I think people really want a more radical form of equality. People are aware that representation is insufficient. But then, and I think that people are in fact aware of both of those things. But what's complicated about kind of realizing that the telos, the culmination of some of these, the stratification way of thinking about class is actually a focus on disparity, is that if you don't question that assumption about what class is, then it's like the logic of the argument starts forming in such a way where that does end up being the implicit goal that you have, even if you don't profess it as your implicit goal. Like, what are we after? We want a proportionate number of people in every single job description. And it's been, and we seem to be attacking the people that want to change the quality of those jobs or make sure that nobody is working shitty jobs. So there is a way in which these logics become competitive, and the idea of class reductionism gets used to accuse the people, on the one side of not caring enough about what the people on the other side care about. And what is actually going on is that we have substantively ideas about how the world works. It's not and then the debate gets illicitly, in my opinion, moralized, as opposed to we simply disagree about the nature of the problem and the social theory and literally how the world works. So.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I do want to make sure we get into your specific intervention in this debate. We talked a little bit about this sort of broad categories that you're trying to, that you're trying to sort of bring into academic philosophical discourse about it. Some clarity into what are broadly the ways that people outside of philosophy think about what we even mean when we talk about class. So that's where those stratification theory and conflicts theories comes in. But you also talk specifically about your own approach to this being practice theoretic. Can you say what that is?
Yeah. So I decided that the problem with the way people thought about class is that they were not able to mobilize a concept of class in a useful way to inform their understanding of these other oppressions. And of course, I'm addressing people who are talking about race and gender, but it could be any social problem. It could be the environment. It could be just whatever you're worried about. I think that I started noticing that class was a kind of if you were to develop a picture in your mind of what people seem to mean by it, I started thinking about it as this inert sedimented layer on the bottom of a jar. And then we just kind of fill the jar up with other kinds of oppression. We kind of fill it with, okay, there's a class and there's inequality, but then we add racism, and then we add sexism, and then we add disability, and then we add ageism, and then we add all of these things, and all of these things are going to affect the class structure such that we have this very, heterogeneous group of people. And so then I was like, why is it that that's the image that's happening here? Another image would be the multiple systems image, where you have the class structure as one system, and then you have the sexism system, and then the racism system, and then they all intersect, And at a certain point, I was like, there is one factor here that is completely static and not being used to inform the rest of this supposedly robust way of thinking about social oppression and domination, and that's class. So I started saying that there's one problem of failing to acknowledge that class can that there are other kinds of oppression aside from class. And then there's another problem of being unable to use a concept of class to tell you anything else about the world except for that it exists, that it's there. And so I started wondering, what is it about the Marxist tradition that that just wasn't very helpful in making this debate progress. That didn't inspire people to think about class in a more theoretically robust and interesting way. Like, why did people lose interest in this? And so I started targeting the kind of structuralist ideas. So people like Louis Althusser, where class becomes a structure, and it's kind of determined by what Marxists have usually called the forces of production. So like there's a kind of technological development, and class conflict happens inside of that. And I just started realizing that there was a lot of work being done with the idea of structure without actually elaborating what we mean by the structure and like the people that make it up. Who are these people that are doing this struggling? Why do they struggle? Why do they not struggle? And so I started thinking that breaking it down a little bit into something more like tangible that you could grab onto, like real human beings doing stuff, was a better approach. And so I started saying that, you know, class activities, like any other activity in our lives, are practices. And I think that they're uniquely structural. So I don't think that they're like the same practice as, like, I don't know, making dinner or whatever. But like, you go to work, there's compulsions to earn a living. You have to compete with other people. But these are real individuals who are dragging themselves to the workplace. They have ideas about that. They do this on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes they will engage with other people in collective action, other times not. Sometimes they take individual strategies. So there's a whole host of different practices that actually make up the class structure. And I started asking myself, why do people do some things with some regularity and we can expect them to keep doing it? And why are they averse to other things? And then can we build up a theory of a social process, of seeing developmental patterns in the way the class structure evolves? And so I thought it was like my way of resolving some earlier theoretical problems with just thinking about structures like very impersonally, like they're happening over the heads of individual agents. And I thought if we actually go inside it and we try to see what people are actually doing, for lack of a better way of putting it, then we don't have the class reductionism problem, because we're already talking about people who have worldviews. There are norms, there's culture, there's all kinds of things that are going on here. And then, hopefully build out an account of like how nonetheless people are still fit into the working class and the capitalist class and so on. Does that help answer your question?
It does. But I mean, it'd be good to dig a little bit more into the account and like how that might be different from what, from maybe what other people have thought, or maybe just from like the picture that you might get, if you haven't thought about it much one way or the other.
Yeah. Okay. So when I started saying that the class structure is made up of various practices that have a certain degree of regularity, like you can expect that other people will do things, and that's how you decide what you want to do. This isn't really the way people have thought about this, because they've thought, well, if working people go to work, then obviously, they have an interest in joining a union, for example. And if they don't, it's because of ideology or racism or sexism, which could be forms of ideology. So something else has to like intervene. Otherwise, of course, it makes sense for them to join a labor union. And I started thinking that, no, that's not the way that this works. Actually, there are compulsions towards being very individualistic, keeping your head down, making the boss happy, not engaging in confrontation or conflict, fear. And I also started realizing that there's also norms involved here, what people learn to expect from their boss and from their other employees and from themselves is very laden with ideas like merit and what do I deserve given that I'm working very hard. And the class structure produces a set of constraints that people who have all of this going on have to respond to. And so I think what I've brought into the paper, for the ideologically inclined, is a sort of political Marxist take on the way that the class structure evolves. So I talk about individuals or groups who respond to the competitive strengths of capitalism, and they respond to those constraints in very robust ways, either as individuals or collectively. And they have norms that they use to kind of understand whether or not they're successful, what they deserve, what they don't deserve, what other people deserve or don't deserve. And what you can see from what I call the competitive constraint, that you have to compete with other people on the labor market, capitalists have to compete with each other, is an evolving set of patterns that are structural because they're not arbitrary, they're not random, they're not things you can opt out of. They have an objective character in your life, so they kind of seem like an objective constraint. Like, I can't do anything about this. I have to go get a job. And you're going to try to like engage with that structure. And in doing so, you'll also change the structure itself. So like if a group of workers doesn't unionize, then the conditions of their actions are going to be shaped much more by the arbitrary sort of preferences or compulsions of what their employers need or want to do. And if they are able to unionize across, whether within a single firm or across a labor sector, then they're able to influence the direction that the structure takes in some way. And so the reason that my account differs from other Marxist accounts is that I'm interested in that kind of reciprocal give and take between working people and the class structure. So as opposed to just being an impersonal thing that happens over and against the will of any individuals, I actually think that everyone is engaging in it. And their reactions to it depend both on themselves and on how they react collectively. And that is going to have really different outcomes. So like in Germany, where I live, you'll have whole labor union, like sectors of industry are organized, and they can organize as one sector of industry. In Sweden, they can organize like across the entire economy with massive collective bargaining agreements. And in the US, you're lucky if you can get a collective agreement with one firm. These are the products of past attempts to engage with these constraints that were more or less successful. And the reason that I think my account is better, if I can say that, than other Marxist accounts that have been done in more like social theory or philosophy circles is that I go inside the class structure to tell you about how like the developmental patterns will, how you can kind of get the trajectory, like why it is that one group of people is more successful than another. And you can start to see that this will shape the society as a whole and the kind of cultural expectations they have. I mean, the fact that the US is less organized has a profound effect on what people think that they deserve, what they expect from their government, what they expect from their employers. And this has all kinds of cultural ramifications. So you don't have to like be stuck in this like way of, and I also think it's more empowering, you know, because you can change it. People can, and they have, and you have a unique set of obstacles that is the result of kind of past attempts to resolve earlier problems, and now you're inheriting the sedimented effects of those past attempts to solve problems. And so it's just a way of thinking about class conflict and historical development in a more practical minded way than Marxists previously did, I think.
Yeah, no, that's useful. So I think about G.A. Cohen has a paper called the Structure of Proletarian Unfreedom, which was liked a lot, and in there he does like a sentence where he like uses this, he like says something that's like very quickly, it's like blink and you miss it, about how well, when we talk about economic structures, we're really talking about standard uses of economic power. And then there's like maybe like one or two more sentences about it, and that's it. And he doesn't really get into it. But I wonder if maybe some of what you're saying here like tracks what he could have been getting at, when he says this. And I'm also thinking about, you said earlier, people sometimes will think in terms of intersecting systems of oppression, whatever that is, which in some cases, what we're really talking about is some combination of, very real disparities and the which are sometimes the past effects of like literal legal structures, that once existed. And in some cases, oftentimes, I mean, I'm not suggesting these are exhaustive, but like, in some cases, what we're talking about is literally just the P plus P formulation, prejudice plus power, the people in positions of power, having prejudices, which of course is a real thing, and there's tons of evidence for that, that is real and has bad effects. But there does seem to be something different about, even though both of them can be described in that sort of practice level we're talking about as like people who have all sorts of different motivations and all sorts of different incentives, making decisions. And I say, okay, well, one of those motivations, if we're talking about people in power, might be various prejudices. But certainly when you talk about capitalist economic structures, there does seem to be something that's like a little bit different about, if only in terms about there does seem to be a sense in which there's something structural about those standard uses of economic power that's different, even though of course it is about actions made by particular individuals making decisions for particular reasons, but that's less dependent on the ideas, on like their subjective ideas, than just acting on prejudice. Like maybe one simplistic way to put this, just to try to be clear, is like if I'm, I don't know, an employer and I'm horrifically racist against Albanians, and I'm just consumed with hatred for Albanians, I might treat people differently based on whether I think they're Albanian or not. But if I, like in fact many employers do, sincerely don't believe in the existence of classes and think that we're all just free agents contracting with each other, that's not really going to impact my economic decision making as it pertains to people who work for me.
It does. I think it raises a point that I'm going to cite David Kalinski for right now, because he put it this way in a paper that I read recently, where he argued that class is a structure-dependent concept, and other like prejudice is a belief-dependent concept. And so the problem is that when we talk about these things like they are the same, we are committing what philosophers call a category mistake. We are talking about different things two different things in a way that makes them seem congruous when they are not. And the problem with thinking about the way you were describing prejudice and power and whether or not employers will make decisions that are bigoted or not. First of all, I think there's a great deal of historical contingency, and it depends a great deal on what the place and time that you're talking about. But I think if you want to get an idea of how prejudice or bigotry will affect the development of the capitalist class structure, that the thing that you have to keep in mind is that people will have to adapt to it. They have to adapt to the competitive constraint. So let's take race and gender off the table just because those are more controversial. Let's talk about religion. So there are beliefs that you would think in various religions are not compatible with capitalist development. But lo and behold, they become compatible with capitalist development. The Protestant faith in the United States is the biggest example of how religious faith just adapts to the class structure and then rationalizes and continues to behave as though that's not a primary influence on themselves, or even bringing capitalism in to the whole way the ideology works. So people say, okay, like for example, evangelicals are very traditional. This is a form of traditional morality. My claim would be that what is old becomes new again. So in contrast to the way that like Marx used to say all that is solid melts into air, I think that's true, but a better way of putting it is that the things that are old become new again. So tradition isn't what was pre-capitalist and traditional anymore. It's a form of ideology that calls on tradition in a way that is distinctively modern, capitalist, and new. So things don't just go away with capitalism. This is the mistake that liberals make. Liberals think that because capitalism is, neutral, it's identity blind, it doesn't matter, that these kinds of conflicts, that capitalism will dissolve it. And I think socialists have often been optimistic about that too. And I think that's worth, reinterrogating, because it's obviously the case that some forms of oppression, identity, nationality, religion, they remain salient. But I think that what people need to understand about the deep compulsions that capitalism brings upon us all is that we have to accommodate it. We have to adapt to it, adjust to it, make it work, basically. If we hate it, we have to make it work. And then, and sometimes this happens consciously, sometimes it's unconsciously, sometimes it happens, but you don't even realize you're doing it and you're rationalizing it anyway. So I think that there's not a good reason to say that all belief-dependent constructs are going to be vulnerable to adaptation and change within the class structure in that same way, because the competitive constraint and the compulsions that people have to do what they need to do under capitalism are very strong. And that's why capitalism can tolerate a great deal of bigotry and prejudice and not care about it. Or if it wants to, individual capitalists can also challenge it. They can also say, okay, no more of this is getting in the way politically. But it's hard to develop like a meta theory of this because like so much historical variability and geographical variation and so on and so forth. But I think that if people understood that like capitalism is something that like has that kind of strong, those imperatives, that it universalizes in the sense that it makes us all tend to those imperatives in our distinct ways, then you're going to have a much more practical way of thinking about, so that's why racism isn't the same in 2021 as it was in 1960. Weird. Like, that's going to be the changes in the distribution of the class structure, the changes in the way that we relate to one another, they have changed, and therefore so has this ideology. And I do think it is an ideology, but yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess part of, like, you said the view, and maybe we can kind of wrap up on this, but like the view that you're trying to, push back against, said in your original example that, well, if somebody is, a worker, it's obviously going to be in their interest to, to join a union, and if they don't, that's just some like ideology blinding them to their interests. And you want to get away from that a little bit. Say no, like, people have tons of different motives that could be operative at any given time. Some of them are the sorts of things that are naturally described as ideology. Some of them are like in some short term or really like particular sense, contexts seem pretty rational, right? Like I don't, I think I'd be better off, making an accommodation for myself, in this circumstance. But you do obviously still think that there is a strong sense in which everybody who experiences class domination has a collective interest in overcoming that domination. And I think some things you've already said kind of like show how those two can be squared, but maybe like in the last couple of minutes, just like a little bit more explicitly, can you speak to that?
Yeah. So the thing that I am sort of trying to work out is I'm trying to make sense of some disillusionment that people have had in the past and I think currently have with class politics. So earlier generations of Marxists thought that basically class solidarity was something, even if it was difficult and even if they knew very well that they had to work very hard to organize people in their workplaces, these earlier generations were confident and optimistic about the progression of that process. They thought that people would increasingly show solidarity with one another. And I don't want to undersell the accomplishments of the labor movement, but it's also obviously after 50 years of neoliberal retrenchment, we see that especially in the United States, there's a real hesitancy on the part of workers to fight. And in fact, there was a whole generation of people that were like, workers, like, they're pretty conservative, aren't they? Like, maybe they're not, they don't have the revolutionary capacities that we hoped. Maybe they're too, ideologically indoctrinated or interpolated in Althusser's language, or maybe they're just consumeristic, and they have their homes in their prefab homes in the suburbs, and they don't have any interest in more radical politics anymore, and therefore the working class is not the agent of change. And also people just seem averse to doing this, so this way of thinking, the class conflict way of thinking, is outdated. Making claims about self-determination of working people is therefore kind of anachronistic. It's a thing of the past. And I argue that this sort of sells the whole problem pretty short, because just because there isn't an automatic affinity among workers of any race, any gender. I think that that's part of the intervention I make, is that divisions among workers and hesitancy to engage in solidaristic action is not only caused by these factors that these supervening factors like race and gender. There are internal tendencies within the labor market to divide people, to make people fearful, to make people unwilling to participate in collective action. So if we take that as the starting point, that actually it's not the case that people will automatically engage in solidarity, does that mean that there's not a good reason to do it? And I think the answer is no. I think that there is a good reason to do it. I think that the reason is exactly the same as it always has been. We're just less optimistic about it now. And I think that the reason is that working people are collectively and jointly vulnerable to the arbitrary power of employers in the way that is pretty distinct for a social group. So if you think about the way that capitalist production is constantly changing, that, as Bob Brenner always says, that the primary imperatives are to compete for market shares and then move from line to line of, move production sites, move to different industries, make different investments if you can't retain the rate of profitability that you need. The kind of effect that kind of dynamic and competitive system has on people who literally depend on those very people who are making those decisions for their livelihood. That's what I call labor market dependency. This is a form of vulnerability that cannot be understood in an individual way. It has to be understood by the vulnerability of the class, because the only way that you can rectify any part of that is through collective action. Your response to your own vulnerability, like how that's going to work out for you, depends on how you respond with other people. That is not something that other social classes have to do. It is something that workers have to do. And because these people, the capitalist class, have this arbitrary power over their lives, I think you can call it a claim to self-determination, to say you can't just move my plant. You can't just fire people who have built their whole lives around, I'm from Illinois. We have like Caterpillar and, these plants where people work. And now you just have these little like poor communities. We call them river people now because they just live there. You can't do that to people. You can't just fire people and then they build their whole communities up around these areas and then you just get rid of them like they're garbage. That's a lack of self-determination that people don't have. And it's something that people are affected by differentially, depending on skill level, geography, demographics. But the only way that you can challenge that is as a whole, which is why places like Sweden and Germany have stronger worker protections, because they have a higher aggregate level of collective bargaining on the part of labor.
That is a really good place to end, I think. That's I think the perfect note in terms of bringing it back around to the the sort of most important, political takeaways of all this. So yeah, thank you so much, Lillian Cicichera.
Yeah, Cicerchia. Thanks.
Cicerchia. I will get it right. For the first of what I hope are many appearances, so I can keep practicing the surname. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
All right, that was Lillian Cicerchia, I think, but was a great interview. Really excited about discovering Lillian as a guest. Not that she hasn't been on other shows and whatnot, isn't a co-host of a show, but my discovery of her as a guest for this show, I'm really excited about. I really do hope that she comes back many times. I think she's the best new to this show guest in a while. So that was a really good interview. Cale and I are going to have lots of thoughts about that in the post game. So that is going to start in just a couple minutes. Patrons should already have the link. If you didn't get the email, I had somebody tell me that he wasn't getting the email, but just go to patreon.com and you should see it there. And we were going to do a little bit of James Lindsay seeing Marxists under the bed during the main show, but we ran out of time for that, so maybe we'll get to that in the post game. We're also obviously going to talk about that great interview that we just watched, and we're also going to talk a little bit about right-wing populism and update on Charlie Kirk. So I hope that we get to all that in the hour that we have left for the post game. But we're going to get to as much of it as possible. We'll see people there. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and become a Patreon if you possibly can. Cale, do you have something you want to throw in?
No, that sounds good. You should come and watch us. We're gonna talk about like Cohen and Ellen Meison's Woods and Brenner, Chibber, Shake, Botwinick. If you know what I'm talking about, then maybe you don't need to watch it. But I'm guessing a lot of you probably do need to watch this. So we're gonna get into all the best friends on the left.
Yeah, I only know about half of what he's talking about, so I'm excited for it. So we'll see everybody there in just a minute. Left is best.
Left is best. Good night.